The bell rang, signaling the start of another day at Westfield High School. Miss Roberts, the English teacher, stood at the front of the class, her eyes sweeping over the students as they settled into their seats. There was a familiar tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to accompany every lesson she taught. Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the classroom, waiting for the last few students to settle. Among them was a new face, Jasmine King. She stepped into the room, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The other students watched her, some curious, others wary. Jasmine moved toward an empty desk, and Miss Roberts's gaze fixed on her, lips tightening into a thin line. "Well, well," Miss Roberts said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It seems we have a new addition to our class. I do hope you can keep up with our rigorous curriculum." Her emphasis on rigorous was unmistakable, and Jasmine could feel the weight of the teacher's words. She met Miss Roberts's gaze steadily, but said nothing. The tension in the room grew, an unspoken understanding hanging in the air. This was not going to be an ordinary class. As the last few students trickled in, Miss Roberts turned back to the board, but the discomfort lingered in the room. Jasmine remained silent, her posture confident, but there was a storm brewing inside her. Miss Roberts wasted no time, diving straight into the day's lesson. "Today," she said, "we'll be discussing the themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird. Who would like to start?" Her eyes swept the room, deliberately avoiding Jasmine's raised hand. After calling on several other students, Miss Roberts finally turned to her smile tight. "Yes, Miss King. Do you have something to contribute?" Jasmine straightened in her seat, her voice steady. "I believe the novel shows how systemic racism—" Jasmine straightened in her seat, her voice steady. "I believe the novel shows how systemic racism—" "Systemic racism?" Miss Roberts interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension. "My dear, I think you're confusing this classic American novel with some modern political agenda." A ripple of unease passed through the classroom. Some students shifted in their seats, others smirked, clearly enjoying the drama unfolding before them. Jasmine took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of her desk as she tried to maintain her composure. "With all due respect, Miss Roberts," Jasmine continued, "the racial injustice in the book is a reflection of real issues, both in the past and today." "That's quite enough," Miss Roberts snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "Perhaps you should focus on understanding the text as it's written, rather than trying to impose your own interpretations." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Jasmine's jaw clenched, but her gaze never wavered from Miss Roberts's face. Despite the teacher's words, she refused to back down. Miss Roberts turned back to the board, her marker squeaking against the white surface. "Now let's discuss the actual themes the author intended. Can anyone tell me about the symbolism of the mockingbird?" The rest of the lesson proceeded in much the same way. Every time Jasmine raised her hand, Miss Roberts ignored her, bypassing her with a deliberate indifference. The message was clear. Jasmine's voice was not welcome in this classroom. Other students began to notice. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, their discomfort growing with each passing minute. Others, however, seemed to feed off the teacher's behavior, throwing sidelong smirks in Jasmine's direction. Despite this, Jasmine remained composed, her pen moving steadily across her notebook as she took meticulous notes, a quiet act of resistance in the face of injustice. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Miss Roberts stood and announced, "I'll be assigning the groups for the project. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." Her words hung in the air, the implication not lost on Jasmine. She could feel the challenge in the teacher's voice, but she squared her shoulders and met Miss Roberts's gaze with quiet determination. The students filed out of the room and Jasmine took her time gathering her things. As she neared the door, Miss Roberts called out to her, "Miss King, a word." Jasmine turned, her expression neutral. "Yes, Miss Roberts?" The teacher's smile was thin and sharp. "I hope you understand that in this class we focus on facts and analysis, not personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your feelings from the curriculum." For a moment, Jasmine said nothing. Then, with calm that belied the storm inside her, she replied, "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I look forward to demonstrating my analysis skills in our next discussion." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Miss Roberts standing there, her expression a mix of frustration and uncertainty. The door closed behind Jasmine with a quiet thud, but the tension in the classroom remained. The following week, Jasmine walked into Miss Roberts's English class with her head held high. The air was thick with the same tension that had defined their previous encounter. Miss Roberts stood at the front of the room, her eyes narrowing as she saw Jasmine enter and take her seat. The classroom seemed to brace itself for another round of uncomfortable exchanges. Jasmine, however, was determined to stand her ground. She wasn't going to let Miss Roberts's treatment continue unchallenged. As the bell rang, signaling the start of class, the teacher cleared her throat and began the lesson. Today, Miss Roberts's focus seemed laser-sharp on Jasmine. Every glance, every word was calculated and deliberate, as though she were waiting for Jasmine to make a mistake. Jasmine could feel the weight of Miss Roberts's gaze on her, the scrutiny almost suffocating. Her classmates shifted in their seats, clearly sensing the growing tension between teacher and student. The storm that had begun to form in the previous class was now fully raging. "Miss King," Miss Roberts snapped, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Is that gum I see you chewing?" Jasmine froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. But she wasn't chewing gum. Her lips parted in confusion. "No, Miss Roberts, I'm not chewing gum." Miss Roberts's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Don't lie to me, young lady. Spit it out this instant." The rest of the class sat in uncomfortable silence, eyes shifting between Jasmine and their teacher. Some students exchanged glances, while others shifted in their seats, awaiting the next move in this escalating drama. Jasmine stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the trash can and pantomimed spitting out gum, as Miss Roberts's eyes remained fixed on her. When Jasmine returned to her seat, the silence in the room was deafening. Miss Roberts didn't say anything more, but her glare was a constant presence. She had made her point. Jasmine was not above scrutiny, and every move she made would be watched carefully. The lesson continued, but the air was heavy with a palpable unease. Miss Roberts began to nitpick every aspect of Jasmine's participation. "Sit up straight, Miss King," she barked, her eyes locked on Jasmine. "This isn't some casual hangout spot." Jasmine's posture was no different from the other students, but she obeyed, straightening her back. Her fingers curled around her pen, and her jaw tightened in frustration. It wasn't just the lecture that was grating on her, it was the constant undermining of her presence in the classroom. She took a deep breath, focusing on the lesson. She wouldn't let Miss Roberts win. She wouldn't let the teacher break her spirit. As the class wore on, Miss Roberts's behavior grew more overtly hostile. She would look at Jasmine and make small, pointed comments that seemed designed to provoke. Every time Jasmine raised her hand to contribute, Miss Roberts would pause for a moment before deliberately calling on someone else. It was as if Jasmine's voice wasn't just unwanted, it was actively suppressed. It wasn't long before the tension in the room became a silent, unspoken force. Some students exchanged concerned glances, while others seemed to feed off Miss Roberts's attitude, joining in with whispered remarks or subtle jabs. But Jasmine remained composed. She wouldn't let them see how much it hurt. Then came a moment that would break the dam. During a group discussion, Jasmine raised her hand once again, eager to contribute to the conversation. Miss Roberts looked at her, her lips curling into a cold smile. "Yes, Miss King," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do enlighten us with your unique perspective." Jasmine began to speak, her voice steady despite the heavy weight pressing down on her. She made her points, using textual evidence to support her analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird and its racial themes. But as she spoke, Miss Roberts interrupted, her tone sharp. "I'm sorry, but could you please enunciate more clearly? We can't all understand certain dialects." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Jasmine's hands clenched under her desk, and she felt a wave of heat flush through her body. The words hung in the air, their ugliness undeniable. It was a blatant attack, the racism that had been simmering beneath the surface, now exposed for everyone to see. Jasmine's eyes widened, but she refused to let the tears well up. Instead, she took a deep breath, her chest tightening with the effort to remain calm. The racism, so naked and unashamed, was a blow she hadn't been prepared for. But in that moment, Jasmine knew that she could not let this continue. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Jasmine stood, her body trembling with the weight of the confrontation, but her posture resolute. Miss Roberts called out after her, as she always did. "Miss King, please see me after class. We need to discuss your performance." Jasmine turned, her face carefully neutral. "Yes, Miss Roberts." As she gathered her materials, her heart pounded in her chest, but she was determined. She knew this conversation was going to be an ugly one, but she couldn't let Miss Roberts think she was an easy target. She had to stand up for herself. When the last student left the room, Miss Roberts turned to face Jasmine. Her smile was thin and tight, the same condescending expression she'd worn all week. "Miss King," she began, her voice dripping with disdain, "your attitude is becoming a problem. If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider finding a more suitable environment." Jasmine's fingers curled into fists under the desk, but she kept her voice even. "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I'll continue to do my best as I always have." With that, she turned and walked out, the weight of Miss Roberts's words still pressing down on her. But as she stepped into the hallway, a quiet fire burned inside her. Jasmine knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next class was more of the same. Jasmine entered the room with her head held high, determined not to let Miss Roberts see her crumble. The air between them was thick with tension, and it seemed that each interaction was charged with an unspoken challenge. Jasmine had to fight not only for her place in the class, but for her dignity. Miss Roberts stood at the front of the room, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp as they scanned the students. She seemed to be biding her time, waiting for the opportunity to strike. Jasmine could feel it, the weight of the teacher's contempt bearing down on her. "Good morning, class," Miss Roberts began, her voice clipped. "Today, we'll continue our discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird." She barely glanced at Jasmine as she spoke. "But first, let's discuss the symbolism of the mockingbird. Who can tell me what it represents?" The room was quiet, save for the occasional cough or shuffle. Miss Roberts's eyes flicked across the class, landing on the students who had proven themselves compliant in the past. She called on them one by one, giving them praise and nodding approvingly at their answers. But when Jasmine's hand went up again, Miss Roberts' eyes narrowed, and for a moment she hesitated. The teacher's gaze slid past Jasmine, choosing another student with a flick of the wrist. Jasmine's hand slowly lowered as the teacher continued without acknowledging her. Jasmine wasn't surprised. She was used to it by now. But the frustration was still there, swirling just beneath the surface. Why was it so hard for Miss Roberts to see her? Why was her voice always dismissed without question? The lesson continued, and Miss Roberts's behavior grew more hostile by the minute. Every word seemed to be directed at Jasmine, every comment a subtle jab. It was clear that Miss Roberts had made it her mission to undermine Jasmine at every turn. "Miss King," she called sharply as the class worked on a group activity, "you're not writing down the assignment correctly. It's not that complicated, is it?" Jasmine looked down at her paper. She had followed the instructions precisely, but Miss Roberts was determined to find fault. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm following the instructions, Miss Roberts," Jasmine replied quietly, her voice steady despite the rising frustration. "Are you?" Miss Roberts raised an eyebrow, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Because I'm not sure you understand what we're doing here. Perhaps I should give you some extra help." Jasmine bit her tongue, resisting the urge to snap back. She had learned long ago that arguing with Miss Roberts was a losing battle. Instead, she focused on her work, doing her best to ignore the teacher's sharp gaze. As the class drew to a close, Miss Roberts handed out the group project assignments. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Jasmine couldn't help but notice how Miss Roberts seemed to give extra attention to every student in the class, except for her. It was as if she were invisible, an outsider in a classroom where she was meant to be an equal. Miss Roberts's eyes finally landed on Jasmine as she handed her the project sheet. "You'll be working alone, Miss King," she said, her smile tight and forced. "We wouldn't want you to feel out of place, would we?" Jasmine's stomach churned. She knew exactly what Miss Roberts was doing. She was isolating her, making sure Jasmine had no support from her peers. It wasn't just the project. It was a a statement that Jasmine didn't belong, that she wasn't welcome. But Jasmine wasn't going to let Miss Roberts see her flinch. She took the project sheet, her hand steady. "Thank you, Miss Roberts," she said quietly, her voice calm. She didn't need to prove herself to the teacher, not anymore. The class ended without incident, but the feeling of oppression lingered in the air like smoke. Jasmine gathered her things, trying to ignore the stares of her classmates. She had become used to being the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Some students sympathized, others watched with quiet judgment. But no one spoke up. They were all complicit in their silence. As the bell rang and students began to file out of the room, Miss Roberts called out one final time. "Miss King, I need to speak with you for a moment." Jasmine turned slowly, her heart sinking. She knew what was coming. Another confrontation, another attempt to undermine her. She had no doubt that Miss Roberts would make this difficult. She walked up to the teacher's desk, her mind racing. Miss Roberts sat there, her posture cold and formal, her eyes scanning the room as though waiting for Jasmine to speak first. "You're not making this easy, Jasmine," Miss Roberts said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You're intelligent, I'll give you that, but your attitude is disruptive." Jasmine clenched her fists, but she kept her voice even. "I'm not trying to be disruptive, Miss Roberts. I'm just trying to learn." Miss Roberts leaned forward, her tone turning sharper. "That's the problem, Miss King. You think you can just come in here and impose your agenda. I don't know what kind of school you came from, but here, we follow a set curriculum. We don't have room for distractions." Jasmine's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. "I'm not trying to impose anything. I'm just discussing the book, the way it was meant to be understood." Miss Roberts's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps if you spent more time focusing on the actual material and less on your personal opinions, you'd fit in better here." Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. "I don't need to fit in, Miss Roberts. I'm here to learn, just like everyone else. And if you'd let me, I could contribute something valuable." There was a pause. Miss Roberts seemed taken aback by the firmness in Jasmine's voice. For a moment, the teacher said nothing, her gaze hardening. "Well," Miss Roberts said after a beat, her tone dismissive, "I hope you can keep your opinions in check for the rest of the semester. Otherwise, we might have more issues to discuss." Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "I'll keep that in mind, Miss Roberts." With that, she turned and walked out of the classroom, the weight of the teacher's words pressing down on her. She had survived another round, but she knew that things weren't going to get easier. Miss Roberts was not going to stop until she had broken Jasmine's spirit, but Jasmine wasn't going to let that happen. She had a plan. She wasn't going to back down. As she stepped into the hallway, her resolve strengthened. She would find a way to rise above it all. The storm wasn't over yet, but she was ready for whatever came next. The following week, Jasmine prepared herself for what she knew would be another grueling encounter with Miss Roberts. Each day, the tension in the classroom escalated, the undercurrents of hostility becoming impossible to ignore. It was as if Miss Roberts was constantly searching for a way to break Jasmine's spirit, to prove that she was somehow inferior. But Jasmine wasn't ready to give in. That day, as Jasmine entered the classroom, she couldn't help but notice the silence that seemed to fall over the room. The students all filed in, avoiding her gaze. The usual murmur of chatter was absent. Jasmine was the focus of their attention once again, but this time, it felt different. It felt heavier. It wasn't just Miss Roberts who had become a force to reckon with. The entire classroom now seemed to share in the unspoken oppression. Miss Roberts was already at the front of the room, her back straight, her expression as cold as ever. She greeted the class with her usual frosty tone, but today there was something sharper in her voice. "Today, we'll be discussing the symbolic role of race in To Kill a Mockingbird," Miss Roberts began, her eyes scanning the room, lingering just a moment too long on Jasmine. "I expect a mature and academic discussion, not a political rant. Is that clear?" The classroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jasmine's eyes flicked around the room, her heart racing. It was like Miss Roberts was daring her to speak up, to challenge her. The teacher knew that the issue of race in the novel would be one Jasmine felt strongly about, But now it was clear Miss Roberts was looking for any reason to discredit her. Jasmine's hand shot up. "Yes, Miss King?" Miss Roberts asked, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Jasmine could feel the eyes of the class on her. She had been silenced so many times in this classroom, but today she was determined to speak her truth. "I believe," Jasmine started, her voice steady, "that the theme of racial injustice in the novel isn't just relevant to the time it was written, but is still very much present today. The novel addresses the flaws in the legal system, in the ways in which society turns a blind eye to inequality." Miss Roberts's lips twitched into a thin, patronizing smile. "And I'm sure you've drawn that conclusion from your personal experiences, haven't you, Miss King?" A few students snickered, the low chuckles drifting through the room like an undertow. Jasmine didn't flinch. She met Miss Roberts's gaze head-on. "No, Miss Roberts. I've drawn it from the text itself," Jasmine replied. "The book is about systemic injustice, and it's impossible to ignore how it reflects our society today." Miss Roberts shook her head dismissively, clearly irritated. "You see, this is where we differ. You're too eager to drag politics into everything. To Kill a Mockingbird is a classic. You need to appreciate it for its literary value, not your personal interpretation." Jasmine felt her pulse quicken, but she held herself in check. Miss Roberts had been dismissing her ever since she walked into the classroom, and it was clear that nothing she said would change that. But the sting of her words, personal interpretation, lingered like a slap. "I'm not dismissing the literary value," Jasmine said, trying to keep her voice calm, but a hint of frustration slipped through. "I'm simply saying that the racial themes in the novel are just as relevant now as they were then." The class seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Miss Roberts's next move. She paused, her gaze cold, and then she turned back to the board as if dismissing Jasmine's words entirely. "Well, if we're finished here," Miss Roberts said, her tone tight, "we can move on to discussing the symbolism of the mockingbird again. I'm sure some of you will have better insights into that than Miss King's political agenda." The words stung like a slap, and Jasmine felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, but she refused to let it break her. She stayed silent, focusing on her notebook, her pen gripped tightly in her hand. She would not let Miss Roberts see her crumble. As the lesson continued, Miss Roberts' disdain for Jasmine became even more apparent. She called on other students to contribute, each response receiving Miss Roberts' approval, while Jasmine's hand remained ignored and unacknowledged. Every time Jasmine raised her hand, it was as though the teacher was looking for any excuse to avoid her. It was exhausting. Then came the final blow. Miss Roberts announced that the next part of the lesson would involve a group project. As expected, the teacher would assign the groups herself. Jasmine braced herself for what was to come. She had seen this before. Miss Roberts would assign her to a group where she would be isolated, set up for failure. "Let's see," Miss Roberts said, scanning the room. "Sarah, you'll be with Rachel and Matt. Lucas, you're with Tim and Bethany. Jasmine, you'll work alone." The words were sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. The implication was clear. Miss Roberts didn't want Jasmine to succeed. She didn't want her to be a part of the group, a part of the class. It wasn't just about the project, it was about power. Miss Roberts wanted to remind Jasmine that she was an outsider, and that was all she would ever be in this classroom. Jasmine didn't react immediately. She remained still, her face a mask of calm, but inside her emotions roared. Anger, frustration, and the bitter taste of injustice flooded her. It wasn't just the teacher's behavior, it was the cruelty, the way Miss Roberts used her power to isolate and belittle her. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class. Students began to file out of the room, but Jasmine lingered, her mind racing. Miss Roberts had once again tried to break her, but Jasmine knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't give in. As the last student left, Miss Roberts called out to her in a voice that was almost gleeful. "Miss King, I need to speak with you for a moment." Jasmine turned slowly, her heart heavy with anticipation. She knew what was coming. Another conversation designed to humiliate her. But this time, she wouldn't stand by and let it happen. "Miss Roberts," Jasmine said, her voice firm, "if you have something to say, you should say it. I'm not going to sit here and let you demean me again." Miss Roberts' smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "You need to understand something, Miss King," she began, her tone cold. "If you can't accept the rules of this classroom, then maybe this isn't the place for you. I won't tolerate insubordination." Jasmine felt the weight of Miss Roberts's words, but there was no fear in her anymore. No hesitation. She stood taller, her gaze unwavering. "I'll make sure to do my best, Miss Roberts," Jasmine said, her voice steady. "But I won't be silenced. I won't back down." For a moment, Miss Roberts didn't respond. Her eyes narrowed, but Jasmine didn't look away. The tension between them crackled, thick and palpable. Finally, Miss Roberts let out a sigh, her patience wearing thin. "We'll see how long that lasts," she muttered before walking away. Jasmine stood there for a moment, her heart racing. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer afraid. Miss Roberts could try to break her, but Jasmine had found a strength she hadn't known existed within herself. She wasn't going anywhere. This fight wasn't over yet. The days after the confrontation with Miss Roberts were long and exhausting. Jasmine continued to walk into class each day, determined to stay focused despite the constant barrage of hostility from her teacher. Each lesson seemed to carry the same weight, the same oppressive energy. Miss Roberts found new ways to undermine Jasmine, from nitpicking her assignments to offering backhanded compliments about her unique perspectives. But Jasmine remained steadfast. She would not let Miss Roberts break her. As the days passed, something began to shift. Jasmine's classmates, once passive and hesitant, started to take notice. There were no overt acts of support, not yet, but Jasmine could feel it in the air. There was a quiet rebellion brewing among her peers, and it was becoming impossible for Miss Roberts to ignore. On the day the group project presentations were due, Jasmine found herself at a crossroads. She had worked tirelessly on her individual project, researching the racial themes in To Kill a Mockingbird and constructing a carefully crafted argument to present. It was the culmination of weeks of careful thought and study, a response to Miss Roberts' attempts to silence her. She had made sure to include textual evidence, historical context, and scholarly analysis. It wasn't just a school project to her. It was a statement. It was her stand against the prejudice that had tried to suffocate her. When the bell rang, signaling the start of class, Jasmine sat at the front of the room, her project board in front of her. Miss Roberts, as always, made her way to the front of the class, her gaze flicking briefly to Jasmine before moving on. It was clear that she expected Jasmine to fail, that she was hoping to see her falter under the pressure. The first few students presented their projects, each one receiving a smile or a nod of approval from Miss Roberts. The classroom felt charged with anticipation, the tension in the air almost electric. Jasmine's turn was approaching, and with every passing minute, her resolve grew stronger. She wasn't going to let Miss Roberts win. This was her moment to show not just the teacher, but the entire class what she was capable of. When Miss Roberts finally called her name, Jasmine stood, taking a deep breath as she moved to the front of the room. The class was silent as she positioned herself next to the project board. For a moment, the weight of the teacher's gaze felt suffocating, but Jasmine squared her shoulders and began. Her voice was steady as she spoke, presenting her analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird. She detailed the symbolism of the mockingbird, not just as a symbol of innocence, but also as a reflection of societal prejudice. She spoke about Tom Robinson and Boo Radley, two characters unjustly persecuted because of their race and their differences. Her analysis was sharp, clear, and backed by textual evidence. As she spoke, she could feel Miss Roberts' eyes on her, but this time, it was different. This time, there was no condescension in the teacher's gaze. There was only scrutiny, a silent challenge. When Jasmine finished, there was a moment of silence in the room. Miss Roberts didn't immediately speak, her expression unreadable. The class seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "Well, that was certainly unique," Miss Roberts said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I'm not sure I agree with all of your conclusions, but you did manage to present an argument." Jasmine's heart pounded, but she refused to let Miss Roberts' words shake her. She had spoken her truth. That was all that mattered. "I've supported every point with evidence from the text, Miss Roberts," Jasmine replied, her voice calm but firm. If there's a different interpretation, I'd like to hear it. Miss Roberts's eyes narrowed, clearly irritated by Jasmine's response. Your interpretation is limited, she said, her voice colder now. Perhaps if you spent more time appreciating the literary merit of the work, rather than focusing on irrelevant themes, you'd understand the novel better. Jasmine could feel the sting of the teacher's words, but she wasn't about to back down. With all due respect, Miss Roberts, the novel's racial themes are central to its message. If we ignore them, we're missing the point of the story entirely. Miss Roberts's lips pressed into a thin line. We'll see if the rest of the class agrees with you, Miss King. As the class continued, Jasmine felt the weight of the moment lift, her nerves settling into quiet confidence. Her presentation was done, and it had been everything she needed it to be, a demonstration of her intellect, her resilience, and her refusal to be silenced. After the last presentation, Miss Roberts stood at the front of the room, her arms crossed as the class began to pack up. Before you all leave, Miss Roberts said, her tone a little too sweet, I'd like to remind everyone that the next project will require a lot of teamwork. It's important that we all contribute equally to the group. We wouldn't want anyone feeling left out. The veiled insult was unmistakable, directed once again at Jasmine. But this time no one laughed. No one smirked. The class was quiet, and for the first time in weeks the students seemed to be collectively holding their breath. Jasmine stood still, her eyes meeting those of her classmates. A few students exchanged glances and then, to Jasmine's surprise, Sarah, the girl who had always sat in the front row, spoke up. I thought Jasmine's presentation was really good, Sarah said, her voice steady. She made some really strong points about the novel's themes. The room fell into stunned silence. Miss Roberts's eyes snapped to Sarah, but she said nothing. The other students seemed to follow Sarah's lead. One by one, small murmurs of agreement began to spread through the room. Jasmine felt her chest tighten with emotion, but she forced herself to stay composed. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about justice. It was about truth. Miss Roberts cleared her throat, clearly caught off guard. Thank you, Sarah, she said curtly, and then turned to the class. All right, that will be all for today. Please remember the guidelines for the next project. Class dismissed. The students began to file out, but this time there was no rush to leave. Many of them paused as they walked by Jasmine, offering quiet words of support. Some nodded, others smiled shyly, but all of them shared in the unspoken understanding. Jasmine had stood up to Miss Roberts, and in doing so, she had changed the dynamic in the classroom. As Jasmine gathered her things, Sarah came up to her. I'm really sorry I didn't speak up sooner, Sarah said, her voice soft. I should have said something before, but I didn't know what to do. Jasmine smiled, a small but genuine smile. It's okay, Sarah. I know it's hard to speak up sometimes, but I appreciate you saying something today. I'll do better next time, Sarah promised, her voice filled with newfound determination. Jasmine nodded. We all have to, but we're in this together now. As Jasmine left the classroom that day, her father's words echoed in her mind. Change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up. For the first time in weeks, she felt like the tide was turning. She had found her voice, and now it was time for the rest of the world to listen. But Miss Roberts wasn't done with her yet. Jasmine knew that. The battle wasn't over, but it was a fight she was no longer afraid to face. She had the support of her classmates, and more importantly, she had her own strength. And that made all the difference. The days following Jasmine's brave stand were filled with an electric sense of anticipation. The classroom, once a place of tension and silence, had shifted. The students were no longer mere spectators. They had witnessed the transformation of Jasmine from a target to a leader. They had seen her courage, her intelligence, and her refusal to be silenced. It was clear that the dynamics of the class had changed, and Jasmine's actions had planted a seed of defiance in others. But Miss Roberts, though visibly shaken, was not ready to let go of her control. She had lost a battle, but she was determined not to lose the war. Jasmine knew that the final test was coming, and she prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation. The day came when Miss Roberts called a meeting with the school administration. Rumors began to circulate in the halls. Whispers filled the air. Miss Roberts had requested a parent-teacher conference with Jasmine's father. She had already made her intentions clear. She would do whatever it took to prove that Jasmine wasn't fit for her class, to show that her attitude and disruptive behavior were incompatible with the school's standards. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this moment would come. She just didn't know when. But now she was ready. The day of the meeting arrived, and Jasmine walked into the principal's office with her father by her side. The atmosphere was tense, thick with the anticipation of a confrontation that could change everything. Miss Roberts stood at the front of the room, her posture stiff, her face a mask of professionalism, but the coldness in her eyes betrayed her true feelings. Mr. King, her father, stood tall beside Jasmine, exuding calm authority. He had been an ally throughout this ordeal, but Jasmine knew that today would be the day that would reveal just how far Miss Roberts was willing to go. Mr. and Miss King, Miss Roberts began, her tone strained but controlled. I've called this meeting to discuss Jasmine's behavior in my class. Her attitude has become increasingly disruptive, and her insistence on introducing modern political issues into our curriculum is both inappropriate and distracting. Jasmine's pulse quickened, but she stayed silent, her posture straight and her gaze unwavering. She had come too far to let Miss Roberts have the last word. Mr. King spoke first, his voice measured but firm. I'm aware of Jasmine's concerns about the class, Miss Roberts, but I also know that she's one of the brightest students you have. What you perceive as disruptive is simply her engagement with the material. Jasmine is questioning, challenging, and thinking critically, something every teacher should encourage. Miss Roberts scoffed, clearly frustrated. It's one thing to think critically, Mr. King. It's another to constantly derail my lessons and refuse to follow the curriculum. Jasmine's obsession with race and politics is taking up too much of my time. We're supposed to be focusing on literature, not current affairs. I don't think you understand, Miss Roberts, Jasmine interjected, her voice steady. The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are not current affairs. They are central to understanding the book. Ignoring them doesn't do justice to the text or its message. Miss Roberts's face flushed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she crossed her arms, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. I've worked hard on every assignment, every presentation, and every project in your class. I've followed your instructions to the letter. I don't need you to tell me what's acceptable. What I need is for you to respect my voice and my perspective. There was a long silence in the room, and for the first time, Miss Roberts looked uncertain. She seemed to search for something to say, but no words came. Jasmine's father spoke again. I'll make it clear, Miss Roberts, my daughter is not a problem. She's a student who has every right to express herself. And if she continues to feel marginalized in your classroom, it's your responsibility to address that, not hers. Miss Roberts opened her mouth to argue, but before she could say anything, the principal, who had been silent up until this point, interjected. I think we've heard enough, the principal said, his voice calm but firm. It's clear that there are some issues that need to be addressed. I will be monitoring Miss Roberts's classroom in the coming weeks. I expect changes in how she engages with all students, especially those like Miss King, who are actively contributing to the conversation. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. The principal was on her side. The power dynamic was shifting. Miss Roberts had lost, and there was nothing she could do to regain control. I'll ensure that your concerns are addressed, Miss King, the principal continued, looking at Jasmine with a nod of reassurance. Thank you both for your time. As they left the meeting, Jasmine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. She had stood her ground, and she had won. Not just for herself, but for every student who had ever been silenced. The lesson from the story. Jasmine's journey from being a silent victim of prejudice to a confident leader in her classroom carries powerful lessons for us all. In the face of injustice, the story teaches us about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds are against us. The power of voice. Jasmine's story shows that our voices matter. In spaces where our perspectives are dismissed or ignored, it is crucial to speak up. Even when it feels like we are alone, even when the person in power is determined to silence us, we must find the courage to continue expressing ourselves. It is through our voices that change begins. The strength in resilience. Despite the oppressive environment Miss Roberts created, Jasmine's resilience was her greatest strength. She didn't let the negativity define her. Instead, she used it as fuel for her resolve. The story teaches us that, while obstacles may seem insurmountable, resilience can help us overcome them. The importance of support. Jasmine didn't fight this battle alone. She had the support of her classmates, especially Sarah, who spoke up when it mattered. She had the unwavering support of her father, who empowered her to stand her ground. This highlights the importance of surrounding ourselves with allies who believe in us and who will help us when we're faced with difficult situations. Challenging the status quo. Jasmine's journey also shows the value of challenging the status quo, especially when it comes to outdated or harmful ideas. Miss Roberts's refusal to engage with the racial themes in To Kill a Mockingbird was rooted in a narrow view of education. Jasmine's insistence on discussing race was not a disruption. It was an essential part of understanding the novel. Challenging authority is not always easy, but it is often necessary to create positive change. Justice takes time. Lastly, the story teaches us that justice doesn't always come immediately. There were many days when Jasmine felt alone, when her efforts seemed in vain. But in the end, justice was served, not through a single act, but through her persistent pursuit of fairness, her unwavering dedication, and her willingness to stand up for what was right. Jasmine's victory wasn't just in the principal's office. It was in every moment she chose to stand tall, to challenge Miss Roberts's assumptions, and to demand respect. It was in every step she took toward her future, knowing that her voice mattered and that she had the power to change the world around her. The lesson is clear. In the face of prejudice and injustice, it is courage, resilience, and the willingness to speak out that ultimately lead to transformation.